Good evening. Welcome to the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. I'm Joy Connolly, the Provost and Senior Vice President of the Graduate Center, and I'm thrilled to welcome you tonight to this evening's very exciting event, a little unusual event. But before I introduce my guests, let me say a few words about where we are, where we're sitting tonight. The Graduate Center, as our name implies, is a national leader in graduate education at the master's and especially the doctoral levels. It's a place where our faculty and our students work hard to dissolve the walls separating academia from the world outside, the wide world outside, bringing their pioneering research and their creative work to diverse audiences. Our faculty include, as I think you all know, winners of the Nobel, the Guggenheim, and the Pulitzer Prizes, and they teach together one of the largest PhD cohorts in the country. And we're especially proud to rank among the country's top 10 institutions in awarding doctorates to students from underrepresented minority groups. No other graduate school in the country, and I always feel good saying this because some of you may know I moved from an eminent institution downtown, and I feel, much as I love our neighboring institution downtown, I really believe that no other school in the country, certainly in this city, takes more seriously its mission to advance knowledge for the public good and in the public interest. And here's one sterling example of this commitment. Every year, our doctoral students teach over 180,000 CUNY undergraduates, bringing the very best of what we do in our seminar rooms and our labs and our studios into every neighborhood and every borough of this city. So altogether, we make up a large, vibrant, and dynamic community. So think of those three words: large, vibrant, dynamic. We are, I think, with those words, the perfect context for our guest tonight. Novelist Lee Child reaches a huge global audience with his blockbuster series of novels featuring the veteran Jack Reacher. With the 22 novels he's written in this series so far, he's hit the New York Times bestseller list 22 times, 13 times, reaching #1. His protagonist is a fascinating character. Jack Reacher travels throughout the country with nothing but a toothbrush and a commitment to setting wrongs right. In his wandering, he calls to mind for me the hard-boiled, ultra-independent, don't fence me in attitude of male heroes from a century of pretty conservative American literature and movies. But Jack Reacher's attraction to strong, complex women and his intense dislike of ignorant, blustering men also make him something of a progressive hero as well. He always has an eye out for the marginalized person, the person who needs help, someone who might not fit in, and he makes the world right for them. Jack Reacher appears in the latest of Lee Child's books, the critically acclaimed The Midnight Line, and I recommend to you Janet Maslin's terrific review in the New York Times that came out recently. I should note, too, that movies have appeared based on the books you may have seen. Jack Reacher, based on the novel One Shot, and Jack Reacher, Never Go Back, both starring Tom Cruise in the lead role of Reacher. A native of England and a former television director, Lee Child, I'm now happy to say, lives here in New York City. In conversation with Lee Child is Andy Martin. Andy was the first ever surfing correspondent to the Times of London. I'm glad you're all awake and hearing that. And he's also the author of 2 cult classics, Walking on Water and Stealing the Wave. Andy's most recently published book in 2015 is called Reacher Said Nothing: Lee Child and the Making of Make Me. This book is a fascinating study of Lee Child's creative mind at work. It's about the composition of the 20th book in the series, the book, as you heard in the title, Make Me. And it's also a book recording a dynamic, interactive conversation between 2 very interesting thinkers. Stephen Poole of the Financial Times wrote of this book, Reacher Said Nothing, and I quote, "It is as if Jack Reacher wrote literary criticism instead of beating bad guys to death with his elbows." Andy Martin studied under Jacques Derrida in Paris. He's been a Cullman Center Fellow here in New York, and he's written about Napoleon and Brigitte Bardot and Jules Verne, as well as Lee Child. He now teaches French at the University of Cambridge in the UK, and he writes weekly essays for the UK paper, The Independent, really models of great long-form journalism. I highly recommend them to you. We're going to have time for questions at the end of their conversation, but for now, I know you're all eager to hear, so please join me in welcoming Andy Martin and Lee Child.
Good evening, and thank you for coming. Yeah, I tried to think of the worst possible question you could ask a writer. So, Lee, is your book out yet?
Yeah, that's a private joke that we have because, you know, there's a tremendous amount of promotion and marketing and publicity that goes on. And sadly, an awful lot of it, probably about 80% of it, is just reminding people that the book is out or coming out, which is fair enough. People have other things to do. They have complex lives. They have a lot to do in their year. They don't necessarily know exactly when the book is coming out. So the whole thing is about reminding them, yeah, the book is coming out 7th of November. And inevitably, there's going to be at least, I'm going to bump into at least 10 people a couple of weeks later who say, I'm your biggest fan, I'm your biggest fan. When's your new book out? And I'm like, well, it's been out 2 weeks. How big of a fan are you?
All right, here's the second worst question. Have any of your books been turned into movies? No, no, actually, forget that, because I'd like to ask a slightly more complex question. Because, of course, we're all living movies in our own minds. And I'd like you to imagine for a moment that this, tonight, is being turned into a movie. And I, of course, will be played by Ewan McGregor, I think, actually. And I just wondered, you know, who would Lee like to be played by? And I didn't know if maybe, okay, so we're gonna lose the image. I wondered if Tom Cruise could play you, actually. I mean, I think he'd be good for the part. You know, what do you think?
Oh, I get worried as soon as he starts to say he's got a complicated question. We're in a graduate center, and although I am a graduate, I will point that out at the beginning. I am a graduate. I'm a graduate of a 4-year college in England, which was a slight problem because English colleges are supposed to be only 3 years. But it took me 4 to get my undergraduate degree. On top of that, I also have 2 doctorates, but those were honorary, that they gave me for giving scholarships to various institutions. And I'm really happy with that. Doctor of Literature, I am at 2 different universities. And if I'd known you could just buy a degree, I would have done that at the beginning. Would have saved me 4 years. So the question, what was the question?
Yeah, I was, I think I may have promised Lee at some stage never to use the 2 words Tom and Cruise in conjunction.
Oh yeah, who was going to play me in the movie of tonight? Well, there's I want Jeremy Irons to play me.
Jeremy Irons, okay.
Yeah. That would be fine. I mean, he should be a little younger, but
yeah,
you know, I'm not vain in that sort of way. So yeah, Jeremy Irons with that immaculate accent of his, that would be great.
Yeah, I like Jeremy Irons, and I've got one other suggestion for you though, actually, because after I came up with a semi-insane idea of watching Lee write a book, I mean, and he very nicely let me literally look over his shoulder while he was writing it. I was about 2 yards behind him, but still, I could just make out some of the words. After I came up with this idea, people said, oh yeah, that's a cool idea. But why Lee Child? Why don't you find a serious writer to watch? And I would tend to come back with a kind of, you know, a notion that, oh, well, look, you know, I would invoke various names like Camus and Sartre, and okay, there's a bit of Balzac because he drinks so much coffee, and I don't Tolstoy, and even toss in a bit of Jacques Derrida. But, you know, someone alerted me recently to what I think is actually probably why I picked on Lee Child, but also who I think would be really good in playing the part of Lee in the movie, who is Dudley Do-Right. And I sort of wanted to ask Lee if there was a connection there. Is Dudley Do-Right a kind of precursor of Jack Reacher, in fact?
No, not for me, because I'd never paid any attention to him. You know, that's not part of my cultural heritage. So I can't really say that's got anything to do with it. I agree, the chin is sort of similar, but What is the uniform there? Is that...
It's Mountie, of course.
Canadian,
Mountie,
right?
He always
yeah.
gets his man, I think.
Yeah,
That's the idea, actually. But okay, so we'll pass on that guy. We've ruled him out for the part. And, okay, so I just want to quote something, which is the New York Times. This is referring to The Midnight Line, one of the best crime novels of 2017. And okay, I suspect if Lee were rewriting that, he'd take out one of.
I'd also take out of 2017.
All right. Well, now, the thing I want to take out of that questionable sentence is actually crime. Because why does it specifically have to be a genre thing? And
well, the quote begs a question, I think. That's a serious question that, what does it mean to be, what you're saying is it should be called just a novel of 2017. And what makes a novel applicable to any particular year or era? And obviously, I think what makes a novel memorable or relevant is some kind of social realism or critique or some kind of structure or vehicle that you can imagine if somebody 50 years from now or 100 years from now wants to know how we lived, what it was like, what kind of book are they going to read historically? And I think now crime fiction, I'm not particularly suggesting mine should be in this category, to be honest, because I think the Reacher books are so heavily dependent on myth and legend that they are only incidentally socially realistic. But if you want to find socially realistic novels now, you have to go to the crime genre. Nobody else is doing it. So-called serious novelists have given up on realism. And therefore, 100 years from now, if anybody wants to know the day-to-day details, the things that were on people's minds, the sort of things that happened to people, then not necessarily mine, but they're going to have to come and read the crime genre, that's for sure.
There's one surprising thing that Lee said to me that I think is relevant to The Midnight Line, which is that if you were to read all of his books really carefully, you will see that they're actually kind of a diary of what he was thinking or how he was feeling in that particular year. And I noticed one particular sentence in The Midnight Line, this one. We figured he was a rich guy from out of state come to find himself. We get those from time to time. Maybe they're writing a novel. This is someone in Wyoming, and it may not surprise you to learn that Lee recently acquired a house in Wyoming. So I was wondering, is that a reference to you in that book? Is that self-referentiality or what?
No, it was really in reference to my brother. Because I only bought a house in Wyoming because he did. He bought a house in Wyoming, and I went to visit, and it was really pretty nice. I mean, in a million years, I would not have expected to end up owning real estate in Wyoming. But it was pretty nice, and so I thought, yeah, okay, this is fun. But that line is much more about Andrew than me. He's holed up there, he's a writer too. He's holed up there writing a novel, and God knows what the locals think of that.
Okay, well, talking about actually any of Lee's novels, but particularly the most recent one, the key thing is don't screw it up by giving it all away. So I won't do that, but I would like to address one or two of the themes in the book. And one of the things that strikes me as relevant to that sentence there is very much, and of course you're conscious of the question of the appearance of Reacher himself, which is why there was such a controversy over the figure of Tom Cruise playing the part. But okay, so specifically in this, one of the characters is described as being rather wonderful, and she looked like a movie star. So the theme of what people look like, but also the possibility of a tragic divide between what you would like to look like and what you feel your self-image, as it were, seems to underpin this novel, so that you actually have a paradox. And I think I'm not giving too much away here by saying that, the theory of it is that we all have an identical twin who does not look like us. Is that, would you say that's key to that? to the novel? My suggestion.
No.
I knew he was going to say that.
It's, I mean, at this point, if you read Andy's book, Reach Has Said Nothing, you'll understand that my writing process is completely chaotic. I have no plan, no outline, no clue at all what's going to be in the book or where it's going. And there's two things about that line, one specific. The movie star, I felt, was an old-fashioned phrase, in as much as we don't really say that anymore, or we don't really feel that anymore, do we? That a super glamorous person we don't automatically refer to as like a movie star. That's much more of a sort of 1930s thing, maybe even a 1950s thing, but it is not current. So part of it was the movie star dates Reacher as being an old-fashioned kind of guy, old-fashioned thinker. His frames of reference are purely analog, not digital at all. So that's the specific thing about the line. The generic thing about the line was that I'm just rolling along trying to write this novel, and I've got it in my mind. Well, it's no spoiler to say that the novel kicks off because Reacher, well, I'll step it back another step, if you wouldn't mind. I mean, the problem with the Reacher novels, and 22 of them now, is that Reacher has no job. He has no official function. He is unemployed, and therefore, strategically, how do I get him involved in the story each time? Because, you know, if it was a cop novel and he was a police detective in, you know, some precinct in Manhattan, then the story literally comes to him. He's sitting there in the police station, and the story literally comes to him. But he's not employed in any kind of law enforcement or anything, so how does he get involved? And generally speaking, it's just a big coincidence at the beginning. He's walking down some street and something happens. And I do believe that readers give you one free pass in a book, you know, one ludicrous, unlikely thing. They say, sure, but make the rest of it really plausible. So generally speaking, you can get away with the coincidence at the beginning. But I like to change it up a little bit. So in this one, I tried to loop it around so that his very aimlessness is what gets him involved. He's taking an aimless stroll down a street, and he passes a pawn shop window, and he sees all the sad stuff in the pawn shop window, including, you know, the old guitars that never get played anymore, and the trays of cheap jewelry, some of which are class rings from all kinds of obscure Wisconsin high schools. Except one of them isn't. One of them is a class ring from West Point, 2005. And Reacher immediately notices that, and he immediately thinks, and it's also a very tiny ring, therefore it's a woman cadet. A woman cadet has done 4 hard years at West Point, graduated in 2005, which of course meant Iraq and Afghanistan. And now she's pawned her ring. What kind of misfortune made that happen? And so Reacher's up and running trying to find the story, find her. So I'm just rolling along. He's trying to find the owner of this ring, and I've got a whole book to fill, so he can't get there too soon. So I'm thinking, okay, what? Maybe there's a sister. And then I think, maybe there's a twin sister. Because the twin then becomes, the twinness becomes important later in the book in terms of a kind of poignancy about it.
So you're accepting my point then? Okay, the twin thing is important. Okay, I just want to register that.
Yeah,
but look,
I don't have a secret twin that looks nothing like me. I mean, I think that's what you were suggesting, that we all have some kind of shadow person.
I'll tell you what you do have. Okay, your shadow person, because Lee referred to the guitars, and I just, funnily enough, I just happened to have that quote from the pawn shop. As he got closer, he counted the guitars in the pawn shop window, 7. Sad stories, all of them, like the songs on country radio, dreams unfulfilled. Lee's secret shadow person is, in fact, rock guitarist. I was about to say failed rock guitarist, but of course, the idea is not failed at all. But that is in your, deep background, isn't it? The unfulfilled dream of being a rock star. And if I can add on to that, so is all the writing a kind of substitute for being the fifth Beatle, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I've lived in a state of complete and utter disappointment and frustration ever since August 1963, when I decided, okay, my lifetime ambition is to join the Beatles. And that's what I wanted to do. And there were a number of problems in the way of that. They didn't seem to have a vacancy. I was only 9 years old. And I had zero musical talent. But apart from those three minor stumbling blocks, that was my ambition. And I've been basically trying to be in the Beatles ever since.
One of the things that strikes me about his books, I mean, I don't know if people here will agree with it, is that one of the, what makes them so attractive, and perhaps is a neglected aspect, is the music of the books, the music of the sentences. And I know Lee is very keen on onomatopoeia. And in fact, I can remember that he was describing a scene in which some guy gets his brains blown out, and this is what he was doing, Make Me, and he wrote that, you know, the contents of his brain pan hit the wall with a wet slap, I quote. And he goes, oh, wet slap, isn't that beautiful? It sounds, that's just the sound that it would make, wet slap. It's pure onomatopoeia. So he is very conscious.
With the echo built in, wet slap.
Wet slap, there you are. Okay, it's perfect. So you are very conscious of that. But you also talk about, when you're thinking about Reacher, that, because although there's a strong visual element to the books, isn't there also an auditory element? Because you talk about hearing Reacher as if you're actually kind of, you know, hearing a voice.
Yeah, I mean, you know, not in the sense of being sort of supernaturally inspired. It's not like Reacher is whispering to me or anything like that. It really stems from, I do believe that writing is similar to music in that it begins somewhere and it goes somewhere. And there's always obviously when you're listening to a piece of music, there's always a sense that it's heading somewhere, it's getting there, and then eventually it resolves. And the same thing happens with a book. It's time-based, it's chronological. So I do see similarities there. But the fundamental issue really is you have got to think about the reader. And when you are in an environment like this, I mean, you are all instinctive and natural readers. You know, I'm sure that you've read, what day is it today? Monday. I'm sure you've probably already read a book this week. You probably read several books in a week. You know, that's the nature of educated people. But if you want to make a living being a writer, then you've also got to cater for people who are not instinctive readers or who are not natural readers. I mean, literally, it's like the rings of Saturn. If you want a big audience, then it's not just a big homogeneous audience. It's layered. You start in the center with people that read everything constantly. And then you move out and out and out and out until you get to the very far reaches where you have people that read only one book a year. And they read it on their vacation. And you can see them in the airport. I eavesdrop and watch people choose books all the time because it's a professional interest of mine. You know, people like that, they buy it almost as a distress purchase. They think, oh, I better buy a book, damn it. And they go to the bookstore and they buy it, and the greatest possible pleasure you can give them is to give them a good time. And actually, sadly, the greatest possible achievement for them is to finish the book. And I've heard that from hundreds of people. They come up to me with a sort of a look of gratitude in their eye, and they say, I loved your book, I finished it. And I mean, it makes them feel so good about themselves. And so, but you've got to be aware, at the same time that you are trying to entertain the people in the very center of the circle, expert readers who have read everything and will read another 6 books that week, you've also got to take care of the person who's reading 1 book a year. And the best way to do that is to communicate with them in the most natural and human way possible, which is the words on the page become a kind of really primitive and secret audio recording, so that when they're reading, they're hearing somebody tell them the story, that they're literally hearing it in their head. And that is propulsive, it's compelling, and it is musical in the sense in that rhythm is incredibly important. Rhythm is really what the Reacher books are all about. It looks like a simple style, but the rhythm is arranged in such a way that it is constantly tripping forward. There's a forward-leaning momentum all the way through the book so that people are dragged along, literally.
One of the things that Lee often says is that he's not competing with other books. Well, he is, but he's also competing with things like movies or video games and so on, that all these are options that are available to you. What the hell would make you pick, my particular book? And I'm also conscious that he's influenced not just by, although he reads so much, it's kind of slightly mind-blowing, 300 books a year or something like this. He's also influenced by other media, other forms. So, for example, if I can just mention two forms, one play and one musical, am I right in saying that you're setting aside Shakespeare? Am I right in saying, the play that you've seen most often is in fact Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot?
Yeah, it probably is the one I've seen most often, outside of Shakespeare.
The last count, it was something like 39 times or something.
Yeah, I saw when was it, 2-3 years ago on Broadway with Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen. That was the 39th production of Waiting for Godot that I've seen, and by the way, I thought it was awful. But I live in hope that it's one of those, it literally is Waiting for Godot. You live in hope that sooner or later you'll see a good one.
You're going to get pretty picky after the 39th, aren't you, basically? I'd hate to be putting on the 40th production that he goes to see, but okay, but that kind of minimalism, I think, that associated with Beckett kind of seeps into your work. But here's the thing I would really like to know, because unless I've got this wrong, the musical that you've been to see most often is in fact Mamma Mia, with the music of ABBA.
I'd love musicals, totally love them.
Does that get into what? Does that get into the Reacher books at all, actually? The music of ABBA, the Swedish pop band?
I think ABBA are a very interesting phenomenon. I often wonder why ABBA was so popular, and I think possibly because, clearly the music is really powerful mainstream pop music, very jaunty, very attractive. But I think it was the fact that they were singing in English as a second language, and so they were very clear in their diction. Their articulation was perfect in a way that, for instance, Mick Jagger isn't. And I think a lot of people somehow either appreciated that or enjoyed it. But I love the musical theater. I've seen Mamma Mia probably 5 times. You asked me, and he texted me today, had I seen Beautiful, the Carole King. I've seen that twice. I love the musical theater. I go with my daughter. She lives about 10 blocks with me, and we will typically go and see a show 2 or 3 times, and we will sometimes get front row tickets and sometimes front mezzanine and so on to experience it from all different places. I love it, yeah, and I make no apologies for it. Mamma Mia is a great show. The movie was awful, but the show is good.
Okay, well, talking of great movies of our time, I made a short film over the summer starring Lee Child, oddly enough, actually, writing a short story, and it's online. You can find it on the Independent website. It's about 50 minutes long. How to write a short story. And I'd just like to show a little clip from the very beginning of it, which is only about 10 or 15 seconds long, because it picks up something that Lee was saying earlier to do with his methodology, which one day I described to him in one word, which was clueless. And he said, oh, yeah, that is about it, basically, clueless. And so this is where he's talking about writing short story. And the thing that I've noticed that people really like about what Lee is doing, as you'll see you'll see.
I have literally zero idea at this point of how to start it or where I'm going to go with it.
Sound that noise, but I hope you got that he said he had zero idea of what he was doing and where he was going with the whole thing. And, sorry, yeah, by the way, zero idea. Yeah, and I noticed that there was an article, for example, in New Yorker, where I think it was John Lanchester said, that's the most weird and incredible thing. The guy who comes up with a complex book, it's 100,000 words, with intricate plots, doesn't seem to know what he's doing initially. So how the hell does that work? So is that right? Would you? I mean, I've borne witness to this, and my experience is that Lee started with Make Me. That I said, okay, well, where's this going? He said, I didn't know, and then. And in that book, and I'm giving nothing away here, Reacher is wandering around this small town saying, well, what the hell is going on here? And Lee, similarly, was wandering around his apartment, the Upper West Side, saying, what the hell is going on here? So it was a real echo chamber. And then on about page 200, Reacher starts to figure it out because, several months down the road, Lee Child started to figure it out. So they're very much at the, what the hell was going on. So how does that work for you, this system, if it is the lack of a system, in fact, and how you work?
Well, of course, the complexity is in the eye of the beholder. And, inevitably it looks complex. You start out with all kinds of things going on, and then it narrows down to one particular thing going on, and there's a resolution. And so it looks like somehow out of this huge range of stuff at the beginning, the author has synthesized an outcome and pursued it. But that's largely an illusion. I just write at the beginning and put in whatever I want, and then at some point, usually around about the new year, because you mentioned it was January, around about the new year, I start to think, all right, now what are we going to do with this? What does all this mean? What's going on here? I mean, it literally is. What is going on here? And Reacher has to figure it out because I have to figure it out. And I honestly think it would. Every author is completely different and completely idiosyncratic. They all work in different ways. If you have 10 authors in a room, you're going to hear 37 different ways of working. And my particular way is just to let the book figure itself out, let the story tell itself. And it requires a certain amount of faith in doing that. The way I always describe it is that, to me, it feels like I'm a movie stuntman, and I'm jumping off a high building. And while I'm falling through the air, I'm hoping that the props people are maneuvering that airbag into position because it ain't there yet. And I'm hoping it will be there by the time I meet the ground. And it has been so far, happily. But also that was this summer, I think that was in July. And that is the working writer's life, that you pick up these commissions over the years. People say, would you do this? Would you do that? And these days I say no to most things, except if they're for a worthy cause. And it ended up that I had 4 things to do. One was for the ACLU. One was for a literacy project that 92nd Street Y was running. One was for the blind charity in Britain. And the 4th one was for something else I can't even remember. But I had 4 short stories to write and 4 days to write them in. So, and Andy sort of made this look like it was some kind of a feat or a choice that I was going to write a short story in 1 day, but it was not. It was a necessity.
Yeah, and I wondered if he would actually manage it. In fact, I got bored with watching him at a certain point. Plus, also, I have to kind of get out there before I drive him crazy. So he, in fact, texted me. I think it was at like 4 minutes to midnight with the last sentence. So it shows that he is very efficient about it. And look, while I've got the film up, I just want to show one other little clip, which, as you'll see, kind of homes in really on a political question. So I just want to address that. So this little clip lasts almost a minute.
And there are stories about how if they can get in from the blind side and watch you through that camera.
The ultimate Orwellian nightmare.
Yeah, literally Big Brother. Isn't that what happened in Big Brother?
I think so,
watch
yeah.
back through screens.
I think so, yeah.
Yes, but where else can you go with this? If you go elsewhere, you are really heading into territory where you're going to be criticizing. And, you know, can I stand the hassle of some big scandal about, oh, you know, I'm criticizing American democracy.
Getting political.
Getting political, it's British anyway, and all that sort of stuff.
I remember you have got into trouble with that kind of thing in the past.
Yeah, you know, but then isn't that kind of the point of writing, to get into trouble? So at the moment, I think I'll go. I want to stop on that point where he says, yeah, the point of writing is to get into trouble. And I was thinking specifically of, I think it was Nothing to Lose. If I remember, in Nothing to Lose, Lee had, in fact, been in touch with a serving soldier, I think in Iraq or Afghanistan, captain of the infantry, and they had exchanged correspondence by email, I guess. And in short, Reacher ultimately in that book quotes word for word something that serving soldier had said to Lee, basically critiquing US foreign policy. And then, of course, when the book comes out, various NRA guys and others start sending you all this hate mail because they feel that Reacher was insufficiently gung-ho. Is that the gist of it? Because I think very often, you know, a kind of crude view of Reacher would be, he is ex-military, that he is gung-ho, but it seems to me that in some sense he puts exactly the opposite view. But how did that work? I mean, that's undoubtedly true, that Reacher is appealing to people who wear red baseball caps, shall we say, because of his very nature. And but you know, Reacher's a solid. He's an anarchist, really, and he has no time for that kind of bullshit. And he often will react in a way that is very liberal. But the backstory to Nothing to Lose was that, you know, the military went over to the Middle East in March of 2003, and they were in severe danger and trouble for a lot of the time, but in brief spurts, and a lot of the rest of the time they are in their posts or on the bases and generally quite bored. And they will play video games or watch movies, and then when they run out of those, they'll read books. And of course, we were all sending packages of books for them to read. And they start to read the books, and they, oh, wow, we like Reacher, and they get into Reacher, and then they're also on the internet, of course, in those bases. And so they write to the author, because now we're in an era where it's very easy to get in touch with the author through the website. And so I would get this huge volume of correspondence from Iraq and Afghanistan. And what was really fascinating about it, for literally the first year, easily the first 12 months, it was all just banter and trash talking. You know, I'd get emails from Delta Force guys saying, we could kick Reacher's ass. And I would write back and say, no, he could kick your ass. And back and forth, and then they say, nah, we could kick his ass. And I say, yeah, I'm sure you could kick his ass, but I'm trying to make a living here. And it's no good for me to have, you know, this is my hero, he's not really very good at anything. And so we would, you know, correspond on that basis for a very long time. And then really suddenly with a lot of guys, and it ended up 15 or 20 guys, really very suddenly they would switch on a dime because they had fallen victim to what a lot of readers feel is that they really know the character now. They really relate to the character. They love the character. And therefore they assume in their head they know the author. And the author is now their intimate as well. Because people do envisage a kind of identity between the character and the author. So all of a sudden, the tone changed, and for about at least 15, if not more, individuals were writing to me with real issues, because it's a very difficult thing. When you are serving in the field, who can you talk to? If you've got something on your mind that is, you're worried about something or upset about something, who can you talk to? You can't really talk up the chain of command. You can't talk down the chain of command. You're a bit guarded about talking sideways to people of the same rank. You certainly can't tell your family at home, specifically not your mother or a younger sibling. That seems to be a thing. And so who do you talk to? And so all of a sudden they were telling me what was on their mind. And it was really powerful stuff and very convincing. I mean, the basic message was they felt they were working to a higher standard than the civilian leadership in DC was working to. They felt betrayed and let down by the Bush administration, frankly. And they were saying various things, very powerful emails. And one of them was 16 lines long, and I quoted it in its entirety. I sort of changed one of the names to make it fit the book, and I changed the punctuation a little bit to make it flow. But fundamentally, every single word was a literal transliteration of this email, stating the case that duty is a two-way street. We will do it, but they must do it too. And ultimately, the conclusion of that speech is Reacher is relatively sympathetic to a guy who's gone AWOL and will not go back. And so that was in the book. And then, yeah, there was an enormous shitstorm of criticism and hate mail. I mean, literally, in the sense that Random House, my publisher, in the US, is the only publisher I've got that does not check reader mail before they send it on. They just send it on unopened. And so for a period of about 4 months, I was getting probably between 6 and 10 envelopes a day. And usually they would have that offending page torn out and torn up, sometimes used as toilet paper, all sent. And I just thought how staggeringly hypocritical this is, because they're criticizing me, calling me a sort of pinko commie Englishman. It's their guy, you know. Support our troops, it says on the back of their foreign trucks, and yet this is their troops talking to them, and they don't want to hear it. So it's an issue that you don't necessarily want to get into every 5 minutes, because it wears you out.
The funny thing is that not everyone can kind of get through to Lee, so every now and then I get messages directed to me, but really addressed to him. For example, I've had "Burn in Hell, Child" is one of them. That's one of the most quotable ones.
That's one of the nice ones, yeah. But I always would, wherever possible, because at that time, when I was touring to promote the book, I would do a tour blog. I don't want to do a blog all year round because I haven't got enough to say, but I did it while I was touring so that people that can't get to the events have a flavor of what it's going to be, of what it's like. And so on that blog, I would tell them, you know, if you've written to me criticizing that passage, I'm going to be in, North Carolina tomorrow at such and such a time at this place. Come and we'll discuss it on the sidewalk after the event. That's what I said to them, and not a single one of them turned up. So I put that in the blog the next day. Not a single one of them turned up, just like they didn't turn up in Vietnam.
I should point out that the "Burn in Hell, Child" messages are counterbalanced by the marriage proposals, but yeah, actually,
it's counterbalanced by a lot of nice stuff. I mean, actually, this year for me there was a quantum shift this year. There was a migration that I wasn't quite expecting, because I toured briefly 2 weeks to support this new book. And whereas previously, many times, I've been introduced to babies or children, always by their father, always carrying the birth certificate, proving that they've named their baby, first name Jack, middle name Reacher, and then the surname. Many times that's happened. But this year, twice, I was introduced first to a little baby and then a 4-year-old boy whose first name was Reacher. So, it's getting there.
You're having a huge influence on the population explosion in the US. Talking of which, that could be relevant to this particular quote, because I'd like to give you some real sentences. Again, I don't think it's giving too much away from the Midnight Line. And those of you who know the book will recognize what this is referring to. Not better than fentanyl, which comes up quite a lot in the book. He was sure, but better than aspirin. He could testify to that. What is he actually describing there? Answer, it's a sex scene, in fact, which has just taken place. Now, although it's kind of funny, the thing that struck me, and I like to talk about gender here, is actually, this is not a quote from Jack Reacher himself. It's written by the quasi-omniscient narrator, but it's representing Reacher's point of view, so that he is actually Reacher. But, you know, if you read that carefully, you will see that it's Reacher trying to reflect not his point of view, because, of course, Reacher refuses to have an aspirin, even when someone's bashed him over the head with a heavy, blunt instrument. Aspirin, no, thank you. Much less fentanyl. So he's actually representing the point of view of someone who is, in fact, addicted to fentanyl. So within that Reacher's point of view, he is representing, in fact, a woman's point of view. So there's a kind of complexity to that, and it just struck me that, in fact, one of the things we've discussed is, are you ever going to write a novel from the point of view of a woman? Because it has been suggested. In fact, it was suggested to us by an audio artist who noted that there's a very good guy who does the Jack Reacher voice on audiobooks, and she, slightly subversively, said, well, why can't I do it? And Lee said, oh, yeah, that's not a bad idea, actually. There are all sorts of contractual problems, but you didn't think that was particularly weird. And, I mean, it struck me that, well, for example, okay, this is my bright idea. Perhaps some of you might want to run out and do this, in fact, actually. Take The Killing Floor, for example. It's written in the first person from Jack Reacher's point of view. What if you were to rewrite that book from the point of view of the female protagonist in that book, who's a police officer, in fact? So wouldn't that be cool?
It would be. I mean, it would be very cool, but it runs you into this thing. And in writer world, there's always an ongoing debate. To what extent are we entitled or capable of writing from a radically different point of view than our own? You know, Reacher is a white male, and could I write? I mean, I can plausibly write a white male being one. Now, could I write a black male? Could I write a white woman? Could I write a black woman? And my guess is, I don't think, without getting to that prohibitive level of saying that nobody should step out of their ethnic zone, I think that if you consider the complexity of a person's life, on any particular day, they are the sum of every preceding day in their life, plus probably a lot of secondhand cultural heritage that they've inherited. Could I make a convincing job of inhabiting a character that I have not shared remotely any of those experiences? And I would think probably not. I think it would be a pastiche. I think it would, you know, you could probably finesse it so that it looked pretty good, but at its heart, it would be phony, in my opinion. I mean, I think women have had lives that I have not had, with disadvantages that I've not had, possibly advantages that I've not had. The whole mixture is different. Certainly people from different races in a world that is largely white, people from different races have suffered handicaps that I have not suffered. Would I inhabit that character properly? My guess is probably not. So it would be a gimmick rather than a sort of true or organic piece of work.
Although it does get into this book quite a bit, actually, because you're representing Nakamura's point of view, I seem to recall, when she sees Reach for the first time, for example. Then you have
absolutely. I think absolutely you can write convincing characters if they're the secondary character, because you know that character in the same way that you know your friends or your family or you know, close associates. You can represent them exactly right because you have friends or relatives who are like that, and so you can get close enough. But to make it the main character, I really don't know. I mean, I represent addicts very well in this book, and that's because, you know, I am one. And therefore, I've got less comeback on this book than I expected, because it is completely about addiction. I wrote the book really because I'm not an issues writer at all. I never think, okay, this is hot, I'm going to write about it. I never do that. I just write about whatever is on my mind. And what was on my mind for this book is the general process of solving a problem, which I always believe has got to start with acknowledging the reality of the problem, actually facing the facts. And inevitably, a lot of those facts are very inconvenient. And when we talk about the opioid epidemic in America, the really inconvenient fact is that people have very hard lives. They want to take the edge off. And the most inconvenient fact of all is that an opioid high is a wonderful thing. It makes you feel fantastic. And until we face that fact, we're never ever going to solve the problem. If we just scold and prohibit and tut-tut, we'll go nowhere. We've got to face the fact that it feels really good. And so rather than prohibit the substance, we would need to remove the reason. So that's where all that stuff came from. And people have been thinking, wow, great, this is really on point, it's really on topic for this year, but that is entirely accidental.
All right, another sentence from the Midnight Line. Talking about Reacher's eyes, which he found most, and he's just about to start threatening people, by the way. Eyes, which he found most people liked, except he could blink and come back different, like changing the channel from a happy show to some bleak documentary about prehistorical survival 1 million years ago. A brilliant sentence, I think. But one of the things that strikes me about Lee's writing, and although there is that diary element, I like to refer to it as mythic realism, because it has this kind of pre-textual element. I mean, I was reading E.O. Wilson's brilliant book on the origin of creativity, I think, origins of creativity, and little sentence there, he talks about the humanities, or literature in particular, representing, I'm quoting, the emotions of ancient primate ancestors. And Leah sometimes described Reacher as a gorilla who can paint. But that kind of gorilla element, or the ancient primate aspect that is, inherent in that sentence, that's something which, on the one hand, they are living in Wyoming and so on, but in the diary aspect, but you're also very keen to bring out this kind of, prehistory, the paleontological aspect of Reacher.
Yeah, I love the idea of prehistory, and the last several decades, since I was in college, I met my wife at university, and she was an archaeology and prehistory student, so I was interested in it at that time. And the last 40 years have been fantastic for new research. I mean, we know so much more now than we knew then, a lot of it through DNA. And one of the things that fascinates me is that the DNA trail leads you back to certain bottlenecks in the population, where mainly due to sudden glaciation, has reduced the population. The population outside of sub-Saharan Africa was terribly reduced by various climate change incidents. And the DNA trail shows that, in fact, one of them, it's possible that outside of sub-Saharan Africa, we were down to possibly 1,000 breeding individuals in the entire world at one point. And science, of course, is obligated just the facts, and that's what they say. It's clear that one time in prehistory there was a bottleneck where maybe only 1,000 individuals survived, and that's all that science can know. But then you use your imagination. Well, who were those 1,000 people? The way that science presents it, they sort of, they're just the lucky survivors. The temperature warms up. No, here I am, 999 other people. We made it. But, it probably wasn't luck, and it probably wasn't an accident. Those 1,000 individuals were probably the most vicious, nasty individuals. They had stolen everybody else's food and supplies. They had probably killed the other people in order to reduce competition. So in a lot of ways, we are all descended from the 1,000 most vicious prehistoric characters. And I think we need to bear that in mind.
All right, I've got just a few minutes. By the way, we are opening this up to Q&A in just less than 5 minutes, in fact, actually. So have your questions for Lee Cha ready to go. So if I can ask a couple of quick ones, actually. Do you have to have a messed up childhood to be a decent writer?
I don't know about that. I mean, that is a purely anecdotal thing. I remember a long time ago, I went to Robert Louis Stevenson's house in Edinburgh in Scotland. You know, it's preserved as a little museum, his birthplace. And I took away two things from that visit. The first, and more entertaining actually, was the visitor book, because it was one of those sort of semi-amateur museums, and in the entrance lobby there was a visitor book where you put your name, where you were from, and a comment. And you've seen those, right? Everybody puts in, "Oh, wonderful, best thing ever." And this one guy had put, "adequate in several respects." Which I thought was just the most magnificent comment. So that's now what I put in any visitor book where I go. But the main thing about Stevenson was he had been sickly as a kid and spent 2 years in bed or something like that. And the person who was curating the museum and writing the brochure had a theory that people who are kids who are sick and in bed for 2 years probably will become a writer because they're just left to their own devices, they're left to their own imagination, they probably read a lot because they're bored, and that seems to be borne out by evidence. But then the other thing that somebody got me thinking about was that not so much writers per se, but performers as a whole, who I've been around all my life as, you know, before I was a writer, I worked in television, and before that I worked in the theater. And so I've been around performers all my life. And my strong impression of most, I'm not saying everybody, but most performers is they are seeking the love and approval they did not get as children. I think it's that simple for a lot of them. And I think that is certainly simple. One of my good friends in writing is completely explicit about that. That's why he's doing it. He wants somebody to love him where his family didn't. And I think I'm a little bit the same, yeah. I'm trying to do something that will bring people pleasure, because I always found that whatever I did as a kid, people were annoyed about. It didn't bring them any pleasure at all. And I think the sensation of bringing somebody pleasure is a nice thing, and I'm searching for that, yeah.
Yeah, the funny thing is, I remember one of Lee's most poignant lines to me is, despite being a super best-selling writer and so on, what am I going to do about the 20% of people on Amazon who hate me? But talking of Amazon, okay, this is my last question, then we're going to open up. Look, we talked about art, we talked about science. We need to talk about commerce, because one of the things that struck me, and I think I was the first to notice this, because I did the calculation, is that when Lee was writing Make Me, he was getting paid $100 per word, and that was and, the, a, another $100, right? So as soon as you write, you know, it's a dark and stormy night, you can put your feet up, basically. And I reminded him that recently. He said, oh, it's way more than that now. It was actually 200. And I asked a fellow writer before coming over here, what question would you like to ask Lee? And she actually said, how do you make 10 million for a book? But translating that out of purely pecuniary terms, what is the secret of writing a bestseller? In 2 sentences, please.
The secret of writing a bestseller is to write a book that a lot of people are going to buy.
Thank you, Lee Cha, for that masterful summary. And we are, so people now, yeah, please, feel, I think there are some mics around. Someone is actually coming to us to that mic.
That's
I see.
right.
So you have to come to the microphone. Okay, I see. The
Dismounted from my tank.
gentleman here.
Yes, that's
I
right.
recognize as Guy Fantresca. Please.
Since you were talking about genres, a question about the styles of the last 3 novels. So Make Me, I felt was a total mystery, because no matter what was going on, it was overshadowed by this one question: what the hell's going on in Mother's Rest? It so dominated everything that the thriller and crime aspects were secondary. And then Night School was written like an international espionage thriller. And it had the cinematic quality, because you've mentioned you did that intentionally. And I was thinking Ridley Scott should direct this. And then this book seems to be a synthesis of everything. It's definitely one of the best things you've ever done, because it has the emotional pull, it has the thriller, the mystery, the crime, the suspense. The suspense was really, really well done at each chapter ending. So the style of those three last books, perhaps you can comment on.
Well, thanks, but I really just do my best with each book, you know, and I have no, as we've said, I have no idea what's going to be in it, and therefore I certainly don't have any idea of what overarching style or feel it should have. The suspense thing always intrigues me, in as much as surely all books need suspense. Otherwise, why would we ever read any? Why would we continue reading unless there was some motivation to turn the page? So I think suspense has to be a given. And in a suspense book, sure, maybe you emphasize the suspense a little more than other aspects, but all books need suspense, and all suspense is basically just saying, what is going on here? That's what it is. And in Make Me, absolutely, you just did not know what was going on. In Night School, I felt that it was set up very early that a shadowy figure was trying to sell something that we didn't know what it was for $100 million. And so the suspense in that book is, what is this thing? And in The Midnight Line, again, it's set up very early. We know the parameters of the book. Reacher is going to try and find a woman veteran. And the suspense in that book is, what is her problem? So I always regard it as a fairly simple linear thing, to be honest. And I'm not personally sensitive to noticing a difference in style or approach, which, you know, I'm not saying that to be falsely naive about it, but I think absolutely that is the nature of writing and reading, that it is literally, and I'm not saying this is some kind of woolly feel-good compliment, but it is literally the reader who creates the story. It's really not me telling the reader what the story is. What's just happened is exactly what should happen. The reader should tell me what the story is, because you read it, presumably after November the 7th when it came out. I finished it on sometime in April, and therefore I completed it in April. And I put some strange black marks on white paper. And then some months later, you scanned your eyes over those black marks. And in your head, a whole story took place. And it's your head, you know, your mental energy. It was your calories being burned at that point, not mine. And therefore, the story is happening to you. And therefore, I think it's absolutely fine. You tell me what you tell me what the story was, and I've heard what you're saying, and I think that's really interesting. I was not aware of those gradations.
Thanks.
And I carried a nuke in Iraq during the Cold War.
And
my question is totally irrelevant, because I read your books from when I was 20 years younger on a beach, and I got men interested, my husband. And the point is, you're a gentleman from England, and you specified that you'd like to be Jeremy Irons. And I've got two British men sitting up there on the stage and talking about novels that take place in the United States. And your character is American. And I just think that there's a reason you've chosen to do the genre that you did choose all along. And it would be interesting to hear about why. And I guess maybe we have more violence. And I like the character, and I really do like the way you portray him. And I, think that there's a big issue for me to hear you not write about England, but write about the United States' character.
Well, don't forget I was out of work in England, and I was out of work for it was just a bad reason, and because I had a great job. I had a great job in England. I was a television director, And I worked for a company called Granada Television, which was a fabulous, fabulous producer and broadcaster, drama producer, also documentary producer, just the greatest company. For instance, in my very first week I was there, I was being trained by an older woman who'd been there a long time and knew everybody. My very first week, she said, on Friday we're going to have lunch with some actors. So I thought, great, cool. So we show up to lunch, and the actors are John Gielgud, Ralph Richardson, Alec Guinness, and Laurence Olivier.
Oh, yes. Oh.
I was about to turn 23 years old. That was
You're inspired by those people.
Yeah, it was just the most fabulous job. I loved every second of it until one day my boss said something to me that made it just impossible for me to continue there. He said, "You're fired." And so I wrote as an absolute necessity. I needed to make a living, and I was so furious. I was so furious about that situation, which was purely political. I mean, I don't want to go into too much sort of boring political detail, but it was about Rupert Murdoch wanted to have satellite television, and so he wanted to damage and destroy the terrestrial television. And so he did a deal with the Thatcher government that set that whole thing in motion. And so I was furious, I was pissed off. I don't like England all that much to begin with.
You picked a great character.
Especially not in the literary sense, because, you know, I love having an English accent.
Well,
believe me,
not as
in
far
America,
gone.
in America, an English accent is 20 unearned IQ points right there. I love it.
Thank you.
But sadly, England is a stubbornly illiterate country. If you're going to write, you're much better off writing in America, because in America people read more, and they're certainly more willing to take a chance on something new. And that's a surprise to a lot of people. People think that in Britain we are born already having read Jane Austen. And nothing could be further from the truth. I saw some numbers not long ago that said 6 out of 10 British adults, 60%, have never read a book. Never read one since college, but never read a book. You know, it's stubbornly illiterate country, and also very mean about risking money on something new. Whereas America, people will give something a chance. And
Thank you very much.
I'm very grateful for it. And so, but the character of Reacher could not have worked in Britain.
Right,
you know, that's
exactly.
the fundamental thing. He needs the danger, he needs the frontier, he needs the wide open spaces, the immense distances. It's the second book, you know, he's kidnapped in Chicago and he's thrown in a truck and he's driven 1,500 miles to the Rocky Mountains where there's a secret hideout. You can do that in America. You can't do that in Britain. If I'd been kidnapped where I lived and driven 1,500 miles, I would be in Algeria.
Can I just make one very small correction, which I think is significant for Reacher, that of course he's not entirely American. He is Franco-American. His mother is French. So he kind of bestrides the world in some sense. So there's that kind of weirdness to Reacher, as well as the American side.
I wanted him to be, simultaneously at home and not at home. So I made his mother French, and of course he's never lived in the U.S. because of being a military brat.
We have another question.
You wrote a wonderful little, I don't know what you call it, a novella or short story, The Second Son, which was Reacher as a young boy. And, you know, it's sort of the start of that character and of how some of the character formation and the dynamic between him and his brother. And it would be wonderful to hear more about that time in his life.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it was. We did a bunch of short stories actually that we just published as all of them collected in a volume. We published
is that book out yet? By the way?
It's called No Middle Name, and it's been out for 6 months. But it was an experiment first. It was the digital market was coming, and we weren't really sure what to do with it, and so we were experimenting with forms and timing in particular. Because the digital market has completely upended everything, in as much as It used to be that any mention of your book, you would want it in the week before publication or the week of publication. And publicists would spend their whole time trying to prevent things from being said too early and should be said later. And then the digital thing happened with pre-orders, which means it doesn't really matter when you say anything. You can say it all the time because pre-orders are now the new thing. And so the idea for those short stories was we would do one in the summer, and that would maybe stimulate pre-orders for the book in the fall. And so there was a certain freedom and liberty in what I was going to write about. And yeah, I love the young Reacher. The young Reacher is, I don't think it could sustain a whole novel. I don't think we could have a whole novel, Jack Reacher, boy detective. But I think, you know, the short story, there was one when he's 13, there's one when he's 16, nearly 17, and I really had a good time writing those. Some people said he's too like the adult Reacher, but you know, my experience, I haven't changed all that much since I was 17, and I think if you've grown up on Marine bases all around the world, been around the Marine Corps all your life, you are a certain type of person. You know, you're not some little kid. When at 16, you're a pretty fully formed person, so there isn't going to be that much difference. So I felt some of the criticism was not right on that, but I had a great time with it. And there was a homage to my granddad in that one you're talking about, which was that my grandfather was wounded in World War I, lost his leg. And so I have Reacher's grandfather is a guy who makes prosthetic legs for veterans, including making them out of old table legs, because that's ultimately what my granddad did, because he got one from the government that had a knee joint in it. And of course, because he was now relatively immobile, he got fatter and fatter and heavier, and the knee joint kept breaking. So in the end, he just said, I'm going to make my own. So he made it out of a table leg with no joint in it, so it stuck out the whole time when he was sitting down.
Do we have time for one more question? Last question.
Hello, guys. I actually was here for the Bobby Flay lecture, and I went to the wrong room. This is very good, though. Lee, I've never gotten to ask you this question, I don't think, but have you ever considered writing a standalone, taking a break from Reacher?
Well, have I ever considered writing a standalone and taking a break from Reacher? I think that's a really, really interesting question that comes down to the nature of the relationship between the writer and the reader. And I'm not, you know, what I'm going to say might sound purely commercial, but I don't mean it like that at all. I mean it as reading is a bond between the reader and the writer. The reader is in charge of this transaction. The reader wants something. And if after 22 Reacher books, you know, it's pretty clear in my mind, happily, and I'm so grateful for it, but it's clear in my mind that people want to read about Reacher. And so it would be completely perverse, in my opinion, if I suddenly gave you something that was not Reacher, some other type of book. My guess is, and this has happened to me, where you get into a series, you really love the series, and then the book comes out and it's not in the series. And you think, what? And that book, however good it is, that book starts out with 2 strikes against it, effectively, because you're letting people down. I think familiarity and reliability are a huge thing in our entertainment choices. You know, it's like when I go to Yankee Stadium. I get off the train, I'm walking up to the stadium. I know I'm going to see baseball. It's not like I'm walking up to the stadium thinking, is it going to be hockey tonight? Is it going to be basketball? I know what I'm going to get. That's why I'm there. And I think it's very much the same with readers and writers. The reader drives the transaction. You ask for what you want. Now, I know there's a wrinkle in that in as much as maybe you don't know yet what you want. And if you do get something brand new that you've never thought about before, you're totally into it. And that, of course, happens repeatedly with books. But not from writers who've got an established series. They're usually different writers, or very, very early in a series you might make a departure. But, you know, typically my answer to that question is I say, well, would you like me to do something that wasn't Reacher? And most of the time the audience says, no. Although one time one woman said yes. So I'm thinking, uh-oh, so now what do I do? But, and also, even though writers are complete individuals, we work alone, we're complete individuals, you can regard us collectively as a collective. And every single taste is catered for, believe me. You know, it's not up to me to cater to everybody's taste. There's plenty of other writers who are doing a great job in different genres and different areas. So if you're sick of Reacher, then go and read somebody else. And when you're sick of them, come back to me. You know, that's how it works.
I wish David Baldacci was in the audience right now, because I know Lee has a thing against David Baldacci on account of, on the one hand, we have Jack Reacher. On the other hand, we have, over here, John Puller, bearing a strange resemblance to Jack Reacher, but unacknowledged. But anyway, on that point, we have to end. But thank you very much, Lee Child, and thank you.
Thanks for coming.